Good evening. On behalf of the Cuban Cultural Center of New York and Instituto Cervantes, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's book presentation. Frederick Luciani's superb scholarly work on José María Heredia in New York from 1823 to 1825, an exiled Cuban poet in the age of revolution, selected letters and verse. The author will be presented as well as interviewed by the renowned literary critic Adriana Méndez Rodenas, professor of Caribbean and Latin American literatures in the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the University of Missouri, where she also directs the Afro-Romance Institute. Adriana's books and articles on La Condesa de Merlín and Gertrudis Gómez y Avellaneda have resurrected these two pivotal figures in 19th century Cuban literature. An expert on travel writing, she published Transatlantic Travels to 19th Century Latin America, European Women Pilgrims in 2014, with the support of an NEH Fellowship for University Teachers. She is currently tracing the lost steps of Swedish novelist Frederica Bremer in her Cartas desde Cuba, an account of the visionary traveler's 2-month stay in Havana and Matanzas during the spring of 1853. So without further ado, I leave you with Adriana Méndez Rodenas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to join you tonight, and I welcome you to this activity sponsored by the Centro Cultural Cubano de Nueva York and the Instituto Cervantes. It will be my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Fred Luciani. But before I do, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank our sponsors. First of all, a heartfelt thank you to Iraida Iturralde, a dear friend, president of the Centro Cultural Cubano de Nueva York, the Cuban Cultural Center of New York City, and also to the Instituto Cervantes for hosting this event. I also want to thank Paul Hiller for his technical assistance, without whom we would not be able to be here tonight. First of all, a few words about the format. I'll briefly introduce our speaker for this evening, and then give a brief summary of the work that we will be discussing tonight. A really wonderful book on 19th century Cuban poet José María Heredia. And then Professor Luciani will give a PowerPoint presentation about the book. And then he and I will have a dialogue on 19th century Cuban literature, José María Heredia, and other topics of interest. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Frederick Luciani, who is a professor of Romance languages and literatures at Colgate University. His research and teaching interests include the poetry and theater of the Latin American Baroque, as seen in his book, Literary Self-Fashioning in Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, published by the very prestigious Bucknell University Press in 2004. Now, Professor Luciani has turned his insightful scholarly eye to Latin American Romanticism. His most recent book, and the reason why we are gathered here this evening, is titled José María Heredia in New York, 1823 to 1825, an exiled Cuban poet in the age of revolution, selected letters and verse, published by SUNY Press this year. This book shows Professor Luciani to be a well-versed scholar of 19th century hemispheric literary relations, as well as an expert literary translator. The title of the book, again, is José María Heredia in New York. And first, as a Cuban and a lover of 19th century Cuban literature, I'd like to just say a few words about the significance of Heredia for Cubans of all generations, persuasions, both inside and outside the island. Long familiar to Cuban readers, beyond and within insular borders, Heredia is the author of Himno del Desterrado, the Exile's Hymn, a poem that denounces the despotic rule of Spanish colonial administration while lamenting the fate that forced the poet into exile. Heredia assumed the fate of the exile as a consequence of his opposition to Spanish rule, as Professor Luciani will expand on this theme as well. Heredia is followed by a long list of writers like Cirilo Villaverde and Felix Varela, who also took up residence in New York City at mid-19th century, and for the same reason, opposition to the Spanish regime. But more than any other writer of his and subsequent generations, Heredia represents the quintessential experience of the Cuban expatriate. And his verse remains, to this day, an evocation of the pain of exile and the longing for return. What I have termed elsewhere a mythology of return, meaning that it is not often borne out in reality. Heredia is also famous as El Cantador del Niágara, the poet whose poetic renditions of the iconic waterfalls gains him the fame he had so dearly sought at the end of his famous Ode to Niagara. Both in sensibility and in poetic idiom, Heredia's poetry upholds the cult and exaltation of nature so dear to European and Spanish-American Romanticism. Now, an English-speaking audience can appreciate the range of Heredia's poetry with the publication of José María Heredia in New York. A landmark in 19th century Latin American and Inter-American studies, Luciani's study of Heredia, selected correspondence and poetry, illustrates the poet's role in Cuban independence, his extreme solitude and forbearance in exile. And he also reassesses Heredia's place in Cuban and Spanish-American Romanticism. I'll go now with a brief summary of the book to frame what will be Professor Luciani's PowerPoint presentation and give you an idea of the book's content and form. The book opens with an introduction to Heredia's life and works, particularly the 2 years that the poet spent in New York and the Eastern Seaboard, from 1823 to 1825. Heredia was banished from Cuba in 1823 for participating in an early anti-colonial movement known as the Soles y Rayos de Bolívar, in honor of the general who spearheaded Spanish-American independence. An emblematic poet of Cuban exile, Heredia's experience of dislocation, alienation, and adaptation to a foreign land is highlighted in the first section of the book, Heredia and Exile. From his efforts to learn an unwieldy English language to his ongoing struggle to survive financial hardships and a hostile northern climate. Luciani reveals an aspect of Heredia's oeuvre that is not as well known as his celebrated Ode to Niagara, but that led the poet to that iconic landscape. As his travels to upstate New York, Philadelphia, and New Haven testify, Heredia added another facet to his literary persona, that of travel writer, joining a host of 19th century social explorers that extolled the North American democratic experiment as a model to follow. The last section of the introduction, Heredia and 19th century Inter-American literary relations, situates the 1825 publication of Poesías, in New York, the first English translations of Niagara, and the poet's subsequent immigration to Mexico within the context of 19th century hemispheric exchanges. Lastly, a section commenting the task of translation explains the criteria for selection of Heredia's correspondence and poetry, as well as the significance of its appearance in English. And now, after that brief summary of this really wonderful book, I turn now to Professor Luciani, who will give us his PowerPoint presentation about his book.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Adriana. And I'd like to add to yours my thanks to Iraida Iturralde, to the Centro Cultural Cubano de Nueva York, and to the Instituto Cervantes for sponsoring this event and for this opportunity. Your introduction explains so beautifully the context in which Heredia's time in New York and in the United States developed. And I would just add a couple of things along those lines. For example, the fact that he did attract some attention, some limited attention in the American press during and shortly after his time in exile in the United States. But he remains largely unknown. Heredia isn't terribly well known in the Anglo-American world. And even in the Spanish-speaking world, I think he's a figure who's maybe fallen a bit out of fashion, but who most certainly deserves a fresh look. There may be something of a small renaissance happening in Heredia scholarship. There is a project underway in Mexico, co-sponsored by the Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México and the Biblioteca Nacional José Martí, to create a digital platform that would offer Heredia's complete works, even beyond his poetry. And there's a very recent Poesías Completas, an edition edited by Tilman Altenberg and published in Europe in 2020, and it's quite a magnificent achievement. I decided for my book to focus on Heredia's letters and poetry from his time in New York for a few reasons. He was just 19 when he arrived in the United States in exile, and when he left for Mexico, he was only 21, and yet he produced most of his most important poetry by that age. And his letters from that period, especially his travel letters, are really the most compelling ones that have come down to us. And his experience in the United States, I think, is intrinsically interesting. He fled his country under very dramatic circumstances, and he lived as an exile in a place, New York, that was both exciting and terribly foreign to him. And he suddenly had to grapple with so many life challenges. He was facing a totally uncertain future, all while trying to advance a fledgling career as a poet, this being his vocation and his passion. And his letters tell that story. My book includes about 70 translated and annotated letters that Heredia wrote to family and friends in Cuba, mostly from New York, a few from Boston, where he first landed and spent a few weeks, and others from different places during his travels in the Northeast. But the first letter that I include is one that Heredia wrote when he was still in hiding in Cuba, just before his escape. As Adriana has explained, Heredia was implicated as a member of this clandestine group with associations with the Freemasons, the Soles y Rayos de Bolívar, which was formed to agitate for Cuban independence. The group was discovered. Those members that were unable to escape were rounded up and imprisoned by the Spanish authorities. And Heredia wrote this letter to the chief judge in the inquest that followed. And in it, he claims that he had broken off contact with the Soles group the year before. He thought the group was now defunct. and that he had been falsely implicated in it. And the letter was controversial in Heredia's time and remains so to this day. In his first letters from Boston, Heredia describes the circumstances of his going into hiding to avoid arrest in Cuba, his flight from Matanzas on board an American ship, the sea voyage, and his arrival in Massachusetts in November, which was his first encounter with winter and the cold, which turns out to be a theme throughout his letters during his time in the US. He was prone to consumption, which eventually would take his life at the age of 36 in Mexico. And he really suffered terribly in the cold climate of the Northeast. His early letters from Boston also describe how he began to run across acquaintances from Cuba, others who had fled when the plot was discovered. And these men and other Cuban expatriates would be Heredia's group in the US. He would share lodgings with them, travel with them. And for me, one of the most fun parts of annotating the letters was to try to track down as much information as I could on these figures. By the end of December, Heredia and his little group of fellow exiles had relocated to New York. There was considerable ship traffic with Havana and Matanzas, and Heredia could maintain correspondence with friends and family in Cuba. In his letters, Heredia has lots to say about New York. He was naturally curious, and he liked to wander around looking at things. So he frequented the shops of booksellers, public gardens, the theater. He comments on the way of life and the manners of the people. But his letters also describe just the everyday challenges of living in a foreign culture with limited financial resources, his constant worry regarding his legal status in Cuba, and his worry for the well-being of his mother and his sisters in Cuba. His father had died a few years before, and Heredia would have been expected to be the financial mainstay of his family. And now he was dependent on his family in Cuba to support him, which was clearly a source of some anguish. He would spend 2 winters in New York, and especially in the second winter, he was almost constantly ill. In his letters, he begs his mother to give him permission to move on to a warmer climate, which she eventually did, although she wanted him to stay in the United States where she thought he was safest. And as Adriana mentioned, he battled with the English language, which was a source of great frustration. His French was excellent, and of course, he was surrounded by fellow Spanish-speaking expatriates. He wasn't above having a little fun in his letters at his own expense regarding his struggles with the language. And it seems that these struggles limited his ability to make friendships with English-speaking Americans. He describes them from a certain distance, mostly sympathetically and even with admiration, but he also observes in them a certain competitiveness, shrewdness in business dealings, a certain roughness in their manners. In his letters, Heredia also reflects on his involvement in the activities that led to his exile, with varying emotions, with self-pity, some self-aggrandizement, sometimes defiance. His thoughts on this matter are much more nuanced and complicated than those he expresses in his poems, which are unfailingly militant when he refers to Cuban independence. He also expressed considerable bitterness regarding the members of the Soles group, who it seems had turned on their fellow conspirators and given evidence against them as the plot collapsed. And that included someone named Antonio de Betancourt, who turned up in New York and who Heredia knew was one of those who had informed on him. As one might expect, there's also a great deal of longing for Cuba expressed in Heredia's letters. He was especially close to his maternal uncle Ignacio, who was just a few years older. He was a lawyer and a landowner. And Heredia writes his most vivid letters to him, including his travel letters, which apparently Ignacio gave to Domingo del Monte to be published in a Cuban newspaper just a few years after they were written, and I imagine with Heredia's consent. Speaking of Domingo del Monte, We have one letter from Heredia to him from this period, which I included in the book, and it shows the closeness of their friendship, but also that there had been some sort of serious misunderstanding or falling out between the two. Heredia apparently thought that Belmonte had somehow been in league with those who had betrayed him. And then there was a complication of letters between the two getting lost or crossing in the mail. And what's more, Heredia makes repeated references in his letters to his mail being intercepted by the authorities in Cuba, opened, read, I guess, for seditious content, and sent on sometimes, obviously opened or destroyed. And this explains how careful and cagey Heredia is when talking about certain sensitive matters in his letters. He's very circumspect when he talks about his fellow exiles, for example. I even saw in the manuscript originals of Heredia's letters a few places where he first wrote out the names of people he was referring to and then scratched them out and just replaced them with initials. That makes it difficult to assess fully just how Heredia spent his time in New York beyond the things he talks about openly. For example, in this passage in a letter to his uncle Ignacio, Heredia mentions spending time in Spanish says, conventículos matemáticos, mathematical conventicles, which is a very mysterious phrase that I think must allude to meetings of Freemasons. And I wasn't able to pursue this matter as far as I would have liked. I think there's some interesting work to be done there. And interesting as well is the fact that Heredia never mentions Felix Varela, who began exile in the US around the time that Heredia did. The two men must have been in contact. Heredia traveled to Philadelphia in April 1824. We know Varela was still there before he moved on to New York. But even though Heredia describes the city at great length, he never indicates where he stayed or with whom he met. Which brings us to Heredia's travel letters, as I said, written to Ignacio, published by Domingo del Monte. Beautifully written letters, and I think a lot of fun to read. In his letters, Heredia describes, as I said, all manner of things: landscapes, public architecture, steamships, canal boats, the mastodon at the Philadelphia Museum, the way Americans put out fires, the way Americans conduct public protests. But I think I most enjoy when in his letters he describes chance encounters with people along the way. As when on the way back from Philadelphia, he spotted Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, the former king of Naples, the former king of Spain, coming down the road from his estate called Point Breeze that he built in Bordentown, New Jersey, along the banks of the Delaware near Philadelphia. And with Heredia, description almost always leads to some sort of reflection, as in the case of this sighting of Bonaparte, which leads him to a thought on how changeable the fortunes of people are. Maybe he was thinking of his own reversals of fortune. In June 1824, Heredia traveled to Niagara Falls via Hudson River steamboat and Erie Canal packet boat, and wrote a series of letters to Ignacio narrating his trip. His descriptions of the scenery along the way are quite beautiful, but he also was exact in his description of practical aspects of what he saw as American progress. For example, the Hudson River steamboats, which were new, the engineering achievement of the Erie Canal, the economic benefits that would bring to the United States. And this passage in his Erie Canal letters caught my interest. Heredia in general was reticent on the subject of slavery in Cuba. He mentions it here and does seem to condemn it in a few places in his poetry, but he completely passes over the fact that slavery existed in the United States. In fact, it wouldn't be abolished in New York State until 1827, 3 years later. Heredia was, after all, from a slave-owning class. His uncle had a coffee plantation that relied on the labor of enslaved people. In his letters from Niagara Falls, Heredia really pulls out all the stops in terms of description. Niagara was a kind of mecca for the traveler who wanted to experience the romantic sublime, and Heredia took full advantage. He rambled all over both sides of the fall, the American side, the Canadian or English side, and in true romantic fashion, he found congruence between this great natural spectacle and his own emotions. He reveals in one of the letters that he wrote Niagara, the poem, in a kind of spontaneous burst of inspiration, seated right at the edge of the falls. Again, this is a kind of romantic commonplace, but it seems that in this case it was literally true. Moving on to the poems. For this book, I chose 9 of them to translate and annotate, all of which are associated with a period of Heredia's stay in the US. And I'll show a fragment of each of these as a sample. I chose them for their innate quality or their recognized importance, and also for the degree to which they helped to tell the story of Heredia at his time in exile. Heredia published most of his work in 2 collections, both called Poesías, one of which he published in New York in 1825 and the other in Toluca, Mexico in 1832. And these were the sources that I primarily drew on, although many modern annotated editions of his poetry were also extremely helpful. I knew from the outset that I wanted to create translations that were both faithful to the originals and that functioned as poems in their own right. And that meant choosing metric forms that were compatible or analogous to the originals. Heredia wrote this poem for his friend Pepilla Arango, whose family had hidden Heredia on their plantation near Matanzas before his escape. Emilia was Heredia's poetic name for her. This fragment is from a long poem by Heredia that I think is underappreciated, Placeres de la Melancolía, and it really offers a kind of catalog of romantic themes, all revolving around the figure of melancholy, who is addressed as a kind of muse or goddess. The idea being that the pleasures of melancholy are those of meditation and memory and reflection. The poem Atenas y Palmira is a very beautiful description of and meditation on the ruins of those 2 ancient cities. Again, another very common romantic theme, meditation on ruins. Another poem included in the volume is in honor of George Washington. Heredia expresses an idealized view of the founding of the United States, and he echoes the sort of official, hallowed iconography of the founding fathers. It seems that he wanted to present the US as the model of a free republic at this critical moment when the wars of independence on the Spanish-American mainland were just concluding, and Cuba, of course, was facing continued colonial rule. Niagara, Heredia's signature poem, as we said, was very well known in the Spanish-speaking world throughout the 19th century. José Martí has some beautiful passages on it. And it was known in the Anglo-American world too, thanks to a translation published by William Cullen Bryant in 1827. And that's the version that's most commonly anthologized up to the present day. Heredia's poem Proyecto is a kind of fantasy of becoming a corsair or a pirate, which is another stock character of Romanticism, a variant of the romantic hero. There are any number of precedents for this figure in English literature, and Heredia's poem precedes by about 10 years the Canción del Pirata of Espronceda, which is a classic of Spanish Romanticism. The book includes 2 poems that Heredia did not write while in New York, but that sort of closed that chapter of his life. They were both written aboard ship when, in 1825, he left the United States for Mexico, where he would live out his life. The first is Vuelta al Sur, and the second is Himno del Desterrado, which Adriana mentioned, another of Heredia's best-known works. It's an example of how in his poetry, Heredia strikes a much more militant tone than in his letters. And in his novel, Cecilia Valdés, Cirilo Villaverde tells us that in the 1830s, this poem was a sort of underground hit among the young people of Cuba, many of whom learned it by heart. The last poem that I include in the book is the sonnet Inmortalidad. This was a topic that surfaces repeatedly in Heredia's work in two contexts: poetic immortality, as in the last lines of Niagara, and the immortality of the soul, in which Heredia seems to have had a very firm faith. So that gives an overview of the book, and I hope that the book will contribute to Heredia being more widely known in the English-speaking world, and that the introduction and the annotations push the boundaries a little farther of what we know about this great poet who deserves to be even better known in the Spanish-speaking world. And with that, Adriana, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Fred, for that wonderful introduction and summary of your book, and for the beautiful images you shared of the iconic waterfalls of Niagara and elsewhere that Heredia visited. I wanted to take up the last point that you made, which was Heredia's place in the literary canon, and particularly in Spanish America. You rightly point out that your book will signal his importance for an English-speaking audience. But however, despite the fact that Heredia is a canonical Cuban poet, there's still some issues about his place in the Spanish American literary canon. And I hope the audience who is joining us tonight will share our scholars' obsession with this issue of literary history, which is not simply an issue of footnotes. It's really an issue of placing the writers in a tradition and a timeline. So let me address this issue, which I must confess has been somewhat of a pet peeve of mine. So many, when we were graduate students, we studied very many traditional literary histories of Latin America, and I won't name the authors, but in all those literary histories, para variar, without pretty much repeated, it was said that the first poet of Spanish American Romanticism was the Argentine Esteban Echevarría, more well known for his short allegorical tale, El Matadero, which is kind of a denunciation of the caudillo regime of Rosas in Argentina. So it's claimed, these critics claim that Echevarría's Elvira, o La Novia de la Plata, was published in 1832. And La Cautiva, a long captivity poem, appeared in his volume of Rimas, published in 1837. And Fred, you have noted, rightly so in your book, that Heredia published his poesías first in 1825, and then the Mexican edition in 1832. So clearly, both by the date, the depth, and the breadth of Heredia's poetry, the honor of being the first poet of Spanish American Romanticism should be rightly conferred on Heredia. Could you address further this issue of Heredia's role in Spanish American Romanticism and in the Romantic movement as a whole?
Sure, yeah. I agree with you that this is something that literary historians are interested in, but it does have some wider implications, and I'll try to share some thoughts on those. The earliest commentators of Heredia placed him sort of at the end of the 18th century Escuela Salmantina from Spain. Writers like Meléndez Valdés and Cienfuegos and Quintana, and suggested that maybe Heredia was a kind of prelude. I think Menéndez Vidal says he's sort of a faint prelude to Romanticism. And subsequent critics have been more inclined to place him more squarely within the Romantic movement. And others have put him somewhere on a sliding scale between the 18th century past and this new Romantic movement that was just starting or about to flower. And it kind of depends on what sort of lens you use. Clearly, I think there's a debt to writers like Quintana. But if we look at Heredia's library, and we have a kind of transcript of an inventory of his library from when he was in Mexico, his literary culture was vast, and he was reading the English Romantics. He was reading the French Romantics. He translated Sir Walter Scott's novel Waverley, and the Romantic movement was most definitely part of his literary culture. And I think we can give him, even if he's somewhat on the cusp between those two eras, I agree with you that we can give him pride of place, because the Romantic spirit just infuses his work. Absolutely. Perhaps more visible in some poems than in others. Even, for example, in some of his poems that are meditations on ruins, there's a sort of didactic, more 18th century sounding conclusion at the end. But one only has to read Niagara to feel the full breadth of the sense of the Romantic sublime.
Absolutely.
And so I will agree with you, Adriana, that we need to give him pride of place.
Well, great. I'm glad that we are seeing eye to eye on that one, Fred. Let me go on to the next question, taking up what you briefly recapitulated for us, which is the drama of Heredia's banishment as a result of his participation in Soles y Rayos de Bolívar. So you also point out in your book that Heredia received the most extreme sentence, which was banishment from the island, and perhaps those who betrayed him received lighter sentences. But yet, there's one aspect of Heredia's life that still remains somewhat, that clouds his very militant position that, as you well said, he espouses in his poetry, totally favoring Cuban independence. And that is that last letter that he wrote to General Miguel Tacón, I believe in 1836. And he did that really mainly out of desperation, because he really wanted to reunite with his family back in Cuba and also to be back on the island. So this is, as you said, a controversial issue. It has clouded Heredia's name, both among his peers on the island, like Domingo del Monte, but also by later iterations of the Tacón episode, such as we see in Leonardo Padura's historical novel, La novela de mi vida. So one of the issues with historical fiction like Padura is that it could sway subsequent generations of Cuban readers, particularly on the island, to have a certain image of Heredia which would not place him necessarily in the most favorable light. Could you comment on this sensitive historical episode of Heredia's letter to Tacón? What does it say about the Cuban exile experience?
Yes, so that letter was the second of two controversial letters, because also the one he wrote just before he escaped put distance between himself and the Soles movement. He said he thought it was defunct. He'd broken with them a year before. And then 12 or 13 years later, as you said, because he wanted to return to Cuba, there seemed to be a kind of amnesty provision in the air that might enable him to do so. He wrote this letter to Tacón, the Captain General, really saying that he'd given up on the cause of Cuban independence. It's pretty explicit. And it was publicized because it was now good propaganda, right? And Domingo del Monte and others were very unhappy. Del Monte basically shunned him for the very few weeks that Heredia was allowed to visit. And of course, that was very, very painful for Heredia. And I think part of what was going on was that Heredia, through his poetry, intentionally or not, had created this halo of martyrdom about himself. He presented himself, as we've said, in very militant terms, in favor of independence, but also he was the sort of wandering, itinerant poet martyr to independence. That was the persona he created in his poetry. But when we read his letters, we see that his feelings were much more nuanced and conflicted. And so I think when the real Heredia ran into the Heredia that he had created in his own poetry, his readers at the time, and I suppose subsequently, just couldn't accept it and were pretty quick to condemn him. I am not quick to condemn him. He was a complicated human being, like all human beings are, and he was faced with impossible choices. Not to mention the fact that he had had a miserable time in Mexico. He had had success in getting appointed as a judge and a delegate, a political delegate, and so forth, but he faced almost continuous, constant poverty. And because of the political instability in Mexico, he kept getting dismissed from these positions that he was given. At one point, he was fired from a position because only Mexican nationals, and he was still theoretically subject to Spain, could hold that position. And he saw the sort of nonstop civil war in Mexico in the wake of independence. So he had good reason, I think, to feel some skepticism about the prospects for successful democratic government in the new Latin American, Spanish American republics, and also for Cuba. But mostly I just feel that, you know, as a person who has lived in the land of his birth since he was born, me, how could I possibly judge the impossible choices that exile itself imposes upon people?
Right. And I, as a Cuban, and I'm sure I can speak for many of us, we really appreciate that point of view, because I also think that, you know, who are we to cast judgment on Heredia? And for us, there's a continuity there for many of us that left Cuba, you know, particularly during the first wave. After the revolution, things have changed, and now it's a little bit more flux and people can travel back and forth. But for many of us, we spent many years where that return, as I mentioned, it was impossible. So that's why we have this mythology of return that is kind of in our collective psyche, that we long for return, but that has not always been possible for us. So really shedding this new light that you do on Heredia is a very powerful statement. Let's go to the literary side of things and your translations of Heredia's poetry, which are really outstanding. It really, I read them side by side, and I found myself in reading the English versions sensing things or seeing things in the poem that I didn't see when I first read it in Spanish. So could you comment on your task of translation? Were there some poems that proved more of a challenge for you to translate than others? What insights did you gain into Heredia's poetic craft as a result of being not only a critic of Heredia, but also his translator?
Some poems were more difficult than others. I found his silvas to be the most satisfying to translate, because the silva is such a free form in Spanish. Lines of 11 or 7 syllables, but in no fixed order, and rhymes just sort of appear in an opportune way. So that gave me a lot of freedom. I used feet of 5 stresses or 3 stresses, and just looked for rhymes to arise where they might. So that was very satisfying. And I felt that I could be fairly faithful to the original and still create something that worked as a poem, which was always my goal. The poems that had a more strict metrical pattern were more difficult because then you have to be absolutely rigorous with the rhyme pattern. And I worked with a very good friend who kindly read the whole manuscript and who's perfectly bilingual. And he pointed to places where he thought a word that I used in English just didn't have the same sense, the same subtle nuance as it did in Spanish. And shouldn't I use this other word? And I sometimes had to say, yes, I agree, but I need a two-syllable word with the stress on the second syllable, or I really need this rhyme here. So you're always forcing the language a bit more into that straitjacket. But like I said, my goal was always to produce translations that could function as poems in their own right. Otherwise, somebody who couldn't read the original Spanish might say, well, okay, that's interesting content, but I don't hear any music. It doesn't speak to me as poetry. But it's a funny sort of trade-off, because if you do manage to create something that more or less functions as a poem in the other language, then if you're giving the poet a voice, in this case in English, is it still his voice? Or is it the voice of the translator? And that's a dilemma I think you can never quite work out. I've been thinking a lot about that quote about politics being the art of the possible. I think it's the art of the possible, the art of the attainable, the art of the next best. And I sort of think translation is that way. It's what is possible. It's always the next best. It's not the same as reading the original.
But you certainly to us the voice of Heredia, and very beautifully and powerfully in the English versions.
Well, thank you.
I'm sure many English-speaking readers will appreciate that. Let's turn, if we have time, to our last literary topic, which you mentioned as well, which is that Heredia is the quintessential poet of the Romantic Sublime. And his cult of nature is, of course, seen in his famous Ode to Niagara, but in other poems that I discovered in reading your book, and I absolutely love, which was that shorter poem called Proyecto, in which Heredia imagines himself to be a corsair out at sea. Heredia was also a proponent of the period's belief in natural theology, in which the exaltation of nature was very much tied to a belief in a transcendent creator who made the glories of the natural world. So could you expand on this aspect of Heredia's poetry as a poet that expresses the romantic sublime?
Yes, I think Niagara is the place where that the presence of God in nature is most eloquently expressed in his poetry. Niagara Falls is such a strange place to think about nature and to think about it as an environmental space, because it's very much today a degraded space because of tourism and because of industry. Already in the mid-19th century, it was beginning to be used for water power. And it's a place, even in the popular consciousness, that we associate with environmental disaster. If we think of the Love Canal toxic site. And as much as I love going to Niagara Falls, and I don't mean to demean it, I'm always happy to go back. it's a place that, because of tourism, is really, I think, defiled. It's been drilled and tunneled and bridged, and observation decks and stairs and elevators, and if you look at the Canadian side from the American side, it looks like Las Vegas with these high-rise hotels.
Yeah.
And already this was just starting, or about to start, when Heredia visited. He talks in one of his letters about on one of the islands between the two falls, this establishment with billiards and refreshments, and the first hotels and stairs down to the bottom of the falls. But he's not interested in that. He only wants to experience the sublime and to hear the voice of God in the cataract. But he also was capable of a kind of utilitarian view of nature. If you look at his travel letters, when he describes the Erie Canal, he's fascinated with it as a great work of technology, as a great work of engineering. He talks about it as this wonderful artificial river that can cross mountains. So I guess I would say that the poem is an interesting kind of nexus where the natural sublime and the degradation of nature sort of come together, and where we see Heredia somewhat in two modes, or switching from the utilitarian mode of his trip to the full experience of God and the sublime in nature, which for our own environmental consciousness today is something that we would do well, I think, to emulate.
But I'm not sure, Fred, so that notion of degradation comes so much in the poem. Certainly in the letters, as you point out, where he talks about the canal, points to that. But the poem is really an iconic expression of that sense of sublimity, which we have lost because most of us live in either hybrid or mediated environments. We're losing more and more those pristine sites of nature. So in that sense, Heredia is a beacon to remind us that we still need those places,
Yes.
spiritually and emotionally. And so I think that's the value that I see in that romantic exaltation of the sublime, which Heredia has given us.
Yes, I agree. I agree completely.
So, well, those are my questions. I think we are now ready to open up the question and answer period. So if you'd care to join us, please look at the link that's there in the Centro Cultural Cubano de Nueva York, CCC, NYC, and Instituto Cervantes site there, and join us very briefly. We will continue our discussion of Fred Luciani's wonderful book and of the legacy of José María Heredia. Thank you, Fred, for a wonderful tertulia this evening, and to all of you for joining us tonight. Buenas noches.
Thank you very much, Adriana.